New Mexico Territory, 1881. The wind carried the scent of smoke and death across the Badlands when Raphael Ghost Rider burst into the outlaw camp like vengeance itself, his war paint still wet with enemy blood, his voice cutting through the night. Air like a blade forged in hell itself. Release her, or I'll burn this place down and send every last one of you screaming to meet your maker. The campfire crackled and hissed as grease from roasted rabbit dripped into the flames, sending sparks dancing toward the star-filled sky above the Chihuahuan desert. 23 hardened outlaws sat around the fire, their faces weathered by sun and scarred by violence, their hands never far from the iron at their hips. These were not ordinary bandits. They were the remnants of Quantrill's raiders who had fled south after the war, mixed with Mexican pistoleros and army deserters who had chosen the outlaw trail over the hangman's noose. They called themselves the Bonham Gang, after their leader, a former Confederate colonel named Marcus Bonham, who had turned his military skills toward more profitable enterprises. The camp itself was a fortress of sorts, nestled in a natural bowl between three mesas that provided excellent sightlines and limited access routes. Wooden stakes had been driven into the rocky ground to form a perimeter, with sentries posted on elevated positions that commanded views of all approaching trails. Canvas tents were arranged in military precision around the central fire, while their horses were corralled in a rope enclosure near a natural spring that bubbled up from the desert floor. It was the kind of place that could withstand a siege, the kind of place where desperate men could make their last stand against civilization. But tonight, civilization was not coming for them in the form of cavalry troops or federal marshals. Tonight, it rode alone on a black stallion whose hooves struck sparks from the stone as it descended the mesa trail like a spirit of the desert itself. The rider's approach was so silent that the first sentry never saw the knife that opened his throat, never had time to cry out before he tumbled from his rocky perch to land with a soft thud in the sand below. The second guard managed to turn, managed to see the painted face and the cold eyes that reflected starlight like chips of obsidian, but the war club that crushed his skull ended any thoughts of raising an alarm. Raphael Ghost Rider had earned his name through deeds that were whispered around campfires from the Rio Grande to the Colorado River. Some said he could move through enemy territory like smoke, appearing and disappearing at will. Others claimed he had made a pact with the spirits of his ancestors, that bullets would not touch him, and that death itself feared to claim such a warrior. The truth was simpler and far more dangerous. He was a man who had lost everything he loved to white man's greed, and had spent the last 3 years of his life learning every skill needed to take it back. His face was painted in the traditional Chiricahua style, black lines running from his eyes to his jaw like tears of blood, white and red symbols across his forehead that marked him as a warrior who had counted coup on many enemies. His long black hair was bound with strips of leather decorated with eagle feathers and the teeth of mountain cats he had killed with his bare hands. Around his neck hung a necklace of silver conchos and turquoise stones, each one representing a successful raid against the white settlers who had taken Apache land. But it was his eyes that marked him as truly dangerous. They burned with a cold fire that spoke of vengeance delayed but not forgotten, of promises made to the spirits of the dead that would be kept no matter the cost. The black stallion beneath him was a magnificent beast, 17 hands high and bred for endurance rather than speed. Its coat gleamed like polished obsidian in the moonlight, and its eyes held the same intelligent malice as its rider. The horse had been trained for war, trained to strike with its hooves and bite with teeth that could crush bone. Together, horse and rider moved like a single entity, forged in the fires of hatred and tempered by years of guerrilla warfare against overwhelming odds. As Raphael approached the outer perimeter of the camp, he could see the guards had grown careless from months of easy living. They sat with their backs to the desert, their attention focused inward on the warmth of the fire and the bottle of whiskey being passed from hand to hand. These men had grown fat and lazy on stolen gold and easy victories against unarmed settlers. They had forgotten that the desert had eyes, that vengeance could take human form and ride out of the darkness on a night when the moon was dark and the stars offered no mercy. The third sentry died with Raphael's knife between his ribs, the blade sliding up beneath the breastbone to pierce the heart with surgical precision. The man opened his mouth to scream, but only blood emerged, dark and thick in the desert air. Raphael lowered the body gently to the ground, then moved like a ghost toward the fourth and final guard post. This man was more alert, his hand all ready, moving toward his rifle when Raphael emerged from behind a boulder like death incarnate. But alertness meant nothing against a warrior who had been raised from childhood to move without sound, to strike without warning. The guard's rifle never cleared its rest before Raphael's tomahawk split his skull from crown to jaw, spraying brain matter across the rocks. 4 men dead in less than 10 minutes, and the main camp still sat around their fire, laughing and drinking. Completely unaware that death had already entered their sanctuary, Raphael paused at the edge of the firelight, his keen eyes scanning the camp for any sign of the woman he had come to find, Lucy Stone. The name burned in his mind like a brand pressed into his soul. He had tracked her for 6 weeks across 3 territories, following a trail of blood and broken dreams that led inevitably to this place. She was here somewhere, imprisoned in one of those canvas tents, waiting for rescue or death, whichever came first. The outlaws around the fire were telling stories now, their voices carrying clearly in the still desert air. Stories of raids and murders, of towns burned and families destroyed. They spoke of their crimes like trophies, like achievements to be proud of rather than sins to be ashamed of. One man, a thin scarecrow with a scraggly beard and missing teeth, was describing in vivid detail how they had attacked the wagon train 3 weeks ago. "That little blonde girl fought like a wildcat," he cackled, taking a long pull from the whiskey bottle. "Took 3 of us to hold her down, while the colonel decided what to do with her. Pretty little thing, worth more alive than dead, if you catch my meaning." The other men laughed, a sound like hyenas celebrating over fresh carrion. Raphael's hand tightened on his tomahawk until the leather wrapping creaked. These animals had dared to lay their filthy hands on her, had dared to speak of her like she was property to be bought and sold. The rage that filled him was pure and clean, like fire that burns away all impurities. It was time to announce his presence. He stepped into the firelight like an apparition, his painted face terrible to behold in the dancing flames. The laughter died instantly as 23 pairs of eyes turned toward him, some widening in shock, others narrowing in recognition. They knew who he was, they knew what he represented, and they knew that their comfortable little world was about to end in blood and screaming. "My God," whispered one of the younger outlaws, a boy who couldn't have been more than 19. "It's him, it's the Ghost Rider." The kid's hand trembled as it moved toward his gun, but Raphael's voice stopped him cold. "Where is Lucy Stone?" Raphael asked, his words carrying the authority of a man who had never been denied anything he truly wanted. His English was perfect, learned from missionaries, who had tried to civilize his people before discovering that some spirits could not be tamed. "I know you have her. I know what you did to her wagon train. I have come to take her home." Marcus Bonham rose slowly from his position near the fire, his hand resting casually on the butt of his Colt .45. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, and thick through the chest, with graying hair and cold blue eyes that had seen too much death to be impressed by one more Apache warrior. The colonel's uniform jacket hung open over his barrel chest, the brass buttons tarnished but still reflecting the firelight. A man used to command, used to having his orders obeyed without question. "Well, well," Bonham said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of a Virginia gentleman despite the circumstances. "The famous Raphael Ghost Rider, come calling at last. I was wondering when you'd catch up with us. Your reputation precedes you, son. They say you can track a whisper across stone and kill a man with your bare hands." The colonel smiled, but there was no warmth in it, only the cold calculation of a predator sizing up potential prey. "They say many things," Raphael replied, never taking his eyes off the colonel. "Some of them are even true, but I did not come here to discuss my reputation. I came for the woman. Give her to me, and you can live to see another sunrise. Refuse, and I will paint this desert with your blood." The colonel laughed, a rich sound that seemed genuinely amused. "You've got stones, I'll give you that. Riding into a camp full of armed men and making demands like you're in any position to negotiate. But you see, son, that woman represents a considerable investment. We lost good men taking her, and we've got buyers lined up who'll pay top dollar for a pretty white girl with all her teeth. She's worth more than a year's worth of bank jobs." "She is worth more than your worthless life," Raphael said quietly, and something in his tone made several of the outlaws shift nervously. "But I am a reasonable man. I will give you one chance to do the right thing. Bring her out, unharmed, and I will leave you to your miserable existence. Hurt her, and I will show you why the Apache call me Ghost Rider." The tension in the camp was thick enough to cut with a knife. 23 armed men against one Apache warrior should have been no contest at all, but there was something about Raphael that made the odds seem less certain. Perhaps it was the complete lack of fear in his posture, the way he stood as if he owned the very ground beneath his feet. Or perhaps it was the stories they had all heard, the legends that followed him like smoke on the wind. Bonham's smile faded as he studied the painted warrior before him. This was not some half-civilized reservation Indian begging for scraps. This was a predator in human form, a killing machine wrapped in human flesh and motivated by something far more dangerous than mere anger. This was a man with nothing left to lose. "You know," the colonel said thoughtfully, "I think I'm going to keep her after all. Might even sample the merchandise myself before I sell her to the highest bidder. What do you think of that, Ghost Rider? What are you going to do about it?" His hand tightened on his gun, but he didn't draw. Not yet. The smart play was to let his men surround the Apache first, cut off all possible escape routes. Raphael's response was to reach into his belt and pull out a small clay pot sealed with wax. He held it up so all the men could see it, then used his thumbnail to crack the seal. The smell that emerged was sharp and acrid, like sulfur mixed with coal oil. "This is Greek fire," he said conversationally. "A recipe I learned from a chemistry professor in Santa Fe before I killed him for selling guns to the cavalry. One spark and everything within 50 feet burns hot enough to melt steel, including your precious captive if she's too close to the flames." The outlaws exchanged nervous glances. They had all heard stories of Greek fire, the legendary incendiary that had burned ships in ancient wars. Whether this Apache actually had such a weapon or was bluffing with a pot of lamp, oil didn't matter. What mattered was that he was clearly insane enough to use it. "You're bluffing," Bonham said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You wouldn't risk burning the woman you came to save." "Would I not?" Raphael asked, and his smile was terrible. "To behold, I have spent 3 years learning to live with loss, Colonel. 3 years accepting that some things are worth dying for. If I cannot save Lucy Stone, then I will ensure that no man ever touches her again. The spirits of my ancestors are hungry for justice, and they are not particular about how it is served." The Standoff stretched on for long seconds, neither side willing to make the first move. The fire crackled and popped, sending shadows dancing across the tense faces of the assembled men. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the camp, a coyote howled, the sound echoing off the mesa walls like a funeral dirge. Then, from one of the tents at the far end of the camp, came a sound that changed everything. A woman's voice, weak but unmistakably, defiant, calling out into the night. "Raphael! Raphael, is that really you?" The voice was Lucy Stone, and she was alive. The sound of Lucy's voice shattered the tense standoff like a gunshot in a cathedral. Every man in the camp turned toward the source, their attention momentarily diverted from the painted warrior who stood among them, like death personified. It was exactly the opening Raphael had been waiting for. His left hand hurled the clay pot high into the air while his right drew the bowie knife from his belt in one fluid motion. The pot exploded against a wooden post in a shower of flames that spread like liquid fire across the dry canvas and rope. The camp erupted into chaos as men scrambled away from the spreading inferno, their military discipline forgotten in the face of supernatural flame that seemed to burn without fuel. Raphael moved through the confusion like a wolf among sheep, his blade finding the soft spots between ribs and the vulnerable arteries of the neck. The first man died still reaching for his gun, surprise frozen on his face as arterial blood painted the desert sand crimson. The second managed to clear leather before the knife opened his throat from ear to ear, his final shot going wild into the night sky. Colonel Bonham roared orders that no one could hear over the screaming and the roar of flames. His Colt appeared, in his hand like magic, the hammer already cocked and ready to send Raphael to whatever hell awaited murderous Apaches. But the painted warrior was no longer where he had been a moment before. Like his namesake, he had vanished into the smoke and shadows, leaving only death in his wake. The Greek fire spread with unnatural hunger, consuming everything it touched and filling the air with acrid smoke that burned the lungs and brought tears to the eyes. 3 of the outlaws' horses broke free from their corral, their terrified screaming adding to the hellish cacophony as they fled into the desert darkness. The carefully ordered camp became a maze of burning canvas and panicked men, perfect hunting ground for a warrior who had learned to kill in silence. Raphael emerged from behind a burning tent like a demon materializing from the flames themselves, his tomahawk splitting the skull of a Mexican pistolero who had been trying to organize a defensive line. The man's brains splattered across the face of his companion, who screamed and fired blindly into the smoke. The bullet went wide, but Raphael's return throw did not. The tomahawk embedded itself in the shooter's chest with a wet thunk, the steel head disappearing between his ribs. But even as he killed, Raphael's attention was focused on the far end of the camp, where Lucy's voice had come from. Through the smoke and flames, he could see a figure dragging someone from a tent toward the horses. It was Bonham himself, his left arm wrapped around a woman's waist, while his right hand pressed a gun to her temple. Even at this distance, even through the chaos, Raphael could see that it was her. Lucy Stone looked nothing like the vibrant young woman he remembered from their brief encounter 6 months ago in Santa Fe. Her blonde hair hung in tangled knots around a face that had grown gaunt from poor treatment and constant fear. Her dress, once a respectable blue cotton suitable for a merchant's daughter, was now little more than rags held together by hope and stubbornness. But her eyes still burned with the same fierce intelligence that had first captured Raphael's attention, and she was fighting Bonham every step of the way. The colonel was bleeding from a gash on his forehead, where Lucy had managed to strike him with something sharp, probably a piece of broken pottery she had been saving for just such an opportunity. Her hands might have been bound behind her back, but she was using her entire body as a weapon, throwing her weight from side to side to make it as difficult as possible for her captor to maintain his grip. She was magnificent in her defiance, and Raphael felt his heart swell with pride, even as rage consumed his rational mind. Ghost Rider. Bonham's voice cut through the chaos like a cavalry saber. "Show yourself, or I'll put a bullet in her brain right here and now." To emphasize his point, he pressed the gun barrel harder against Lucy's temple, hard enough to leave a circular indentation in her pale skin. She winced but did not cry out, her jaw set in determination that reminded Raphael of the Apache women, who had raised him to be a warrior. Raphael stepped into view, his hands empty but held away from his weapons. 7 men were dead, their bodies scattered around the burning camp like broken dolls. 16 remained, but most of them were too busy fighting the fire or nursing wounds to pose an immediate threat. It was down to him and the colonel now. Predator against predator, with Lucy's life hanging in the balance. "Let her go, Bonham," Raphael said, his voice carrying easily despite the crackling flames. "This is between you and me. She has nothing to do with our war." The colonel laughed, a sound devoid of humor or sanity. "Nothing to do with it? Boy, she's got everything to do with it. You think I don't know who she is? You think I don't know about Santa Fe?" His grip tightened on Lucy's waist, and she gasped as the air was squeezed from her lungs. Miss Lucy Stone, daughter of Jonathan Stone, the merchant who sold information to the cavalry about Apache camps, the same information that led to the massacre at Bear Canyon, where your people died screaming in their own blood. Raphael felt the world shift beneath his feet, like quicksand. Bear Canyon. The memory hit him like a physical blow, bringing back images he had spent months trying to forget. His wife, Morning Star, heavy with their first child, cut down by cavalry sabers as she tried to flee their burning wickiup. His son, who had lived for only 3 minutes in this world before a trooper's bullet ended his brief existence. The elders, the children, the women, all dead because someone had sold their location to the army for 30 pieces of silver. "You see it now, don't you?" Bonham continued, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper that somehow carried across. "The distance, the recognition in those savage eyes. You've been protecting the daughter of the man who murdered your family. How does that feel, Ghost Rider? How does it feel to love the enemy?" Lucy's head snapped around to stare at Raphael, her eyes wide with shock and something that might have been understanding. In that moment, despite the gun at her head and the flames consuming the camp around them, she looked at him with an expression that cut deeper than any blade. It was not fear or accusation, but something far worse. It was pity. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the roar of the fire. "Raphael, is it true what he's saying?" Raphael's world narrowed to a single point of light, a moment of perfect clarity in the midst of chaos. Everything he had believed about himself, about his quest for vengeance, about the woman he had come to save, crystallized into a truth so pure it burned brighter than Greek fire. Yes, Jonathan Stone had sold information to the cavalry. Yes, that information had led to the massacre at Bear Canyon. Yes, Lucy was the daughter of his family's murderer, but she was also the woman who had risked her own life to tend wounded Apache children when disease struck the reservation. She was the teacher who had defied territorial law to provide education to native children. She was the person who had looked into his eyes 6 months ago and seen not a savage or a killer, but a man worthy of respect and affection. She was Lucy Stone, and her father's sins were not her own. "Yes," Raphael said simply, his voice cutting through the night air like a blade through silk. "It is true. Your father sold my people to their deaths, but you are not your father. Lucy Stone, you are yourself, and I have come to take you home." Bonham's face twisted with frustrated rage as he realized his psychological gambit had failed. The Apache's confession should have shattered any bond between captor and captive, should have driven them apart with mutual hatred and recrimination. Instead, it seemed to have drawn them closer together, united by a truth that transcended simple revenge. "Touching," the colonel snarled. "Very touching indeed, but it doesn't change the situation. The girl dies unless you throw down your weapons and surrender yourself to my justice." "Your justice?" Raphael asked, and now his voice carried a note of genuine curiosity. "What justice is there in slavery and rape? What justice is there in burning innocent families in their homes? You speak of justice as if you know what the word means, but you are nothing more than a rabid dog that needs to be put down." The insult hit home, and Bonham's face flushed red with anger. "You think you're better than me, Redskin. You think your cause is more righteous? I've seen what you do to your enemies. I've seen the bodies you leave behind carved up like Christmas turkeys. You're no better than any of us." "No, Raphael." Agreed, and his smile was terrible to behold. "I am not better, I am worse. I am what your people made me, Colonel. I am the sum total of every burned village, every murdered child, every broken treaty. I'm your civilization's greatest achievement, a savage who learned to be more savage than his enemies." As he spoke, Raphael began to move in a slow circle around Bonham and Lucy, his steps measured and deliberate. The colonel turned to keep him in sight, but the movement forced him to shift his grip on his captive. Lucy felt the change immediately and began to prepare herself for whatever opportunity might present itself. "But there is one difference between us, Colonel," Raphael continued, his voice taking on the rhythm of a prayer or an incantation. "You kill because you enjoy it. You destroy because destruction feeds something dark in your soul. I kill because it is necessary. I destroy because creation is impossible, while evil men draw breath." 3 more steps brought him to the exact position he wanted, with a clear line of sight to Lucy's bonds and Bonham's gun hand. The fire had spread to more of the camp now, creating a wall of flame that cut off any possibility of escape or reinforcement. It was just the 3 of them in a circle of light and shadow, predator and prey, and the innocent caught between them. "I know what you're thinking," Bonham said, his voice steady despite the sweat beading on his forehead. "You're thinking you can make some kind of heroic play, save the girl and kill the bad man, but you're forgetting something important, Ghost Rider. I've got nothing left to lose either." The colonel's words were punctuated by the sound of his gun hammer being drawn back to full cock. The metallic click seemed to echo in the sudden silence, as even the fire seemed to pause in its consumption of the camp. Lucy closed her eyes and began to whisper what sounded like a prayer, her lips moving silently as she prepared herself for death. But Raphael had not spent 3 years learning to kill efficiently just to be outmaneuvered by a washed-up cavalry officer with delusions of grandeur. His right hand moved with liquid grace, drawing and throwing his backup knife in a single motion that was too fast for the human eye to follow. The blade took Bonham in the wrist, severing tendons and nerves, and sending his pistol spinning away into the darkness. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The colonel's scream of pain and rage was cut short as Raphael closed the distance between them in 2 great bounds. His shoulder took Bonham in the chest, sending the older man flying backward to land hard against a burning tent post. Lucy stumbled forward, her legs weak from hours of captivity, but managed to keep her balance as Raphael's knife cut through her. "Bonds, can you ride?" Raphael asked, his hands already checking her for serious injuries. There were bruises on her wrists and arms, a cut on her lip that had already begun to heal, but nothing that would prevent her from traveling. She was stronger than she looked. This merchant's daughter who had survived weeks of captivity without breaking. "I can ride," she said, her voice hoarse but determined. "Raphael, we need to go. The fire is spreading, and there are still men alive in this camp." She was right. Even as they spoke, Raphael could hear voices calling out in the darkness beyond the flames, survivors rallying to mount some kind of pursuit. His black stallion was still where he had left it, ground-tied near the entrance to the camp, but getting to it would mean running a gauntlet of burning debris and potentially hostile gunmen. Bonham groaned and tried to sit up, his left hand clutching his mangled wrist while his eyes searched the ground for his lost weapon. Blood streamed between his fingers, dark and thick in the firelight, but he was still alive and still dangerous. A wounded predator was often more deadly than a healthy one. Raphael's tomahawk appeared in his hand as if summoned by thought alone. One quick throw would end the colonel's threat permanently, would ensure that this particular evil could never again prey upon the innocent. But something in Lucy's expression stopped him. A look that spoke of mercy and second chances and the possibility of redemption even for the worst of sinners. "Please," she said quietly, her hand touching his arm. "Don't make me watch you kill again. Not unless you have to." Raphael looked into her eyes and saw something there that he had thought lost forever. Hope. Not just hope for escape or survival, but hope for something better, something that transcended the endless cycle of violence and revenge that had consumed his life for the past 3 years. In that moment, he made a choice that would have surprised the Apache warrior he had been just hours before. He lowered the tomahawk and turned away from the wounded colonel. "You are right," he said to Lucy. "Some men are not worth the effort. It takes to kill them." Together, they ran through the burning camp toward the waiting horse, leaving behind the screaming and the flames and the smell of death that had been Raphael's constant companion for so long. Behind them, Colonel Bonham cursed their names and swore vengeance, but his words were lost in the roar of the fire and the thunder of hoofbeats as the black stallion carried them away into the desert night. The black stallion's hooves drummed against the hard-pan desert floor, like thunder rolling across the heavens, each stride carrying them farther from the burning hell they had left behind. Lucy clung to Raphael's back, her arms wrapped around his waist as they rode through the darkness. Toward an uncertain dawn, the horse beneath them was magnificent, bred for endurance rather than speed, and Raphael could feel the powerful muscles working as they climbed the rocky trail that led up into the Sangre de Cristo mountains. Behind them, the glow of the burning camp painted the night sky orange and red, a funeral pyre for the Bonham gang's reign of terror. They rode in silence for the first hour, each lost in their own thoughts as the adrenaline of their escape slowly faded into the bone-deep exhaustion that follows violence. Lucy had not spoken since they left the camp, but Raphael could feel the tension in her body, the way she held herself rigid against his back, as if afraid that relaxing might somehow betray weakness. She was stronger than any woman he had ever known, this merchant's daughter who had survived weeks of captivity without losing her spirit. But strength had its limits, and even the strongest steel could be broken if bent too far. When they finally stopped to rest beside a natural spring hidden in a grove of ancient cottonwoods, Lucy slid down from the horse's back with movements that spoke of deep fatigue and poorly healed injuries. She walked to the water's edge and knelt, cupping the clear liquid in her hands to wash the smoke and grime from her face. In the moonlight, Raphael could see the full extent of what her captivity had cost her. She was thinner than when he had last seen her in Santa Fe, her cheekbones sharp beneath skin that had been burned by sun and wind. Her hands, once soft and smooth, were now calloused and scarred from weeks of hard labor. "We should keep moving," Raphael said quietly, leading his horse to the water to drink. "Bonham's men will follow us once they get the fire under control. This spring is known to them, and they will expect us to stop here." Lucy looked up at him with eyes that seemed older than her 23 years. "Let me guess," she said, her voice carrying a bitter edge that cut like broken glass. "You know this because you've been here before, scouting their movements, learning their habits. How long have you been watching that camp, Raphael? How long? Have you known where I was being held?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Raphael had known this moment would come, had known that eventually she would ask the questions he had been dreading. The truth was complicated, painful, and likely to destroy whatever fragile trust existed between them. But she deserved honesty, even if it damned him in her eyes. 3 weeks, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I found their trail 3 weeks ago and have been watching the camp ever since. Lucy stared at him in shock, her face going pale in the moonlight. 3 weeks, she repeated, her voice rising with each word. You knew where I was for 3 weeks and you left me there. Do you have any idea what those animals did to me? What I endured while you were out there playing Apache scout? Raphael felt each word like a physical blow, but he forced himself to meet her gaze without flinching. I had to be sure, he said. I had to learn their routines, identify their weaknesses, wait for the right moment to strike. A failed rescue attempt would have gotten us both killed. So instead you let them hurt me, Lucy said, and now tears were streaming down her cheeks. You let them touch me, humiliate me, treat me like an animal while you sat out there in the darkness making your plans. How is that different from what my father did? How is abandoning someone to save your own skin any different from betrayal? The comparison hit Raphael like a war club to the chest, driving the breath from his lungs and leaving him gasping. To be compared to Jonathan Stone, the man whose greed had cost Raphael everything he loved, was almost more than he could bear. But perhaps she was right. Perhaps there was no meaningful difference between Stone's betrayal for money and his own calculated patience. Perhaps they were both guilty of sacrificing innocence for what they believed was a greater good. You are right, he said finally, his voice hollow with self-recrimination. I am no better than your father. I let my desire for perfect vengeance override my duty to protect you. I chose strategy over compassion, and you paid the price for my coldness. Lucy wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving streaks of dirt across her cheeks. At least you admit it, she said. At least you're honest about what you are. My father spent years telling himself he was protecting his family by selling information to the army. He convinced himself that betraying your people was somehow noble, that civilization required sacrifices. But you know you're a killer, don't you? You know exactly what you've become. Raphael nodded slowly, understanding flooding through him like ice water in his veins. I know what I am, he said. I'm a weapon forged by hatred and tempered by loss. I am what remains when everything good and gentle has been burned away by the fires of revenge. I do not ask for your forgiveness, Lucy Stone. I do not deserve it. She studied his face in the moonlight, searching for something in his expression that might explain the contradictions of the man before her. Here was a warrior who had killed 7 men without hesitation, who had burned an entire camp to rescue her, who had tracked her across 3 territories with the single-minded determination of a hunting wolf. But he was also the man who had spared Colonel Bonham's life at her request, who spoke with the educated accent of someone who had learned to walk in both worlds, who looked at her not with the possessive hunger of her captors, but with something that might have been love. Why? She asked suddenly. Why did you come for me at all? If I'm the daughter of your enemy, if my father's betrayal cost you your family, why didn't you just let the Bonham gang keep me? Why risk your life for someone whose very existence must remind you of everything you've lost? Raphael was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the stars that wheeled overhead like distant campfires in the sky. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a confession that had never been spoken aloud. Because when I look at you, I do not see Jonathan Stone's daughter, he said. I see the woman who risked smallpox to nurse Apache children back to health. I see the teacher who defied territorial law to educate native students. I see the person who looked into my eyes 6 months ago and saw not a savage or a curiosity, but a man worthy of respect and affection. He turned to face her directly, and in the moonlight she could see the pain that lived behind his carefully controlled expression. "In Santa Fe, when we spoke in your father's store, you asked me about my life before the wars. No white person had ever asked me that question before. They saw the paint and the weapons and assumed I had sprung fully formed from some primitive darkness. But you wanted to know about morning star, about the son I lost, about the dreams I carried before hatred consumed them all." Lucy remembered that conversation now, recalled how she had been struck by the intelligence in his dark eyes and the careful way he had chosen his words. Her father had been suspicious of any Apache who came to town, had assumed they were all potential thieves or murderers. But Raphael had been different, had carried himself with a dignity that demanded respect, even from those who considered his. "People beneath contempt. You told me about the house you were building," she said softly, "the one by the river where you planned to raise your family. You said it had a view of the mountains and room for a garden where your wife could grow corn and beans." "The house that burned with everything else," Raphael said. "The house that exists now only in my memories and in the stories I told to one white woman who cared enough to listen. When I heard you had been taken, when I learned you were suffering because of your father's crimes, I could not simply let you die. You were the only person in either world who had ever seen me as human." They sat in silence beside the spring, each lost in their own thoughts, as the night wind whispered through the cottonwood leaves above them. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack, the mournful sound echoing off the canyon walls. Lucy pulled her torn shawl more tightly around her shoulders, suddenly aware of the cold, now that the adrenaline of escape had completely faded. "I need to tell you something," she said finally, her voice so quiet he had to strain to hear her, "about what happened in the camp, about what they did to me." Raphael felt his jaw clench involuntarily, his hands forming fists as he prepared to hear details he did not want to know, but felt obligated to witness. "You do not have to tell me anything," he said. "Some burdens are too heavy to share." "No," Lucy said firmly. "You need to know. We both need to face the truth of what my father's betrayal cost, not just your people, but everyone touched by the evil it set in motion." She took a deep breath, gathering her courage like a woman preparing to dive into deep water. "They didn't rape me," she said bluntly. "Bonham wanted to, God knows he wanted to, but he was too smart. He knew I was worth more intact than damaged, knew his buyers would pay premium prices for unspoiled goods. So instead, he found other ways to break me." Her voice grew stronger as she continued, as if speaking the truth aloud somehow lessened its power to hurt her. "They made me cook for them, clean for them, serve them like a slave while they told stories about the Apache families they had murdered. They described your wife's death in graphic detail, Raphael. They laughed about how she begged for her unborn child's life before they cut her down." Raphael's vision went red around the edges, rage coursing through him like liquid fire. His hand went instinctively to his tomahawk, muscles tensing as he prepared to mount his horse and ride back to finish what he had started. But Lucy's next words stopped him cold. "But every night when they thought I was asleep, I heard them talking about their fears, about the Apache warrior who was hunting them, picking off their scouts one by one, about the ghost rider who left no witnesses and took no prisoners. They were terrified of you, Raphael. They knew death was coming for them, and they knew it wore. Your face." She reached across the space between them and took his hand in both of hers, her fingers warm against his cold skin. "That knowledge was what kept me alive," she said. "The certainty that somewhere out there, someone cared enough about me to become the monster these monsters feared most. You may have waited 3 weeks to rescue me, but you spent every day of those weeks making my captors pay for their crimes." Raphael looked down at their joined hands, marveling at the contrast between her pale skin and his darker complexion, between her softness and his calloused hardness. "I killed 11 of their scouts and sentries," he said quietly. "I wanted them to know I was coming, wanted them to feel the fear that Apache families felt when cavalry trumpets sounded in the dawn. I wanted their last weeks of life to be filled with the same terror they had brought to my people." "And they were," Lucy said with fierce satisfaction. "Every morning they woke wondering if this would be the day the Ghost Rider finally came for them. Every shadow might hide death, every sound in the night might herald their destruction. You gave them a taste of the hell they had created for others." A new sound reached them from the desert below, the distant drumming of hoofbeats on stone. Raphael was on his feet instantly, his hand going to his rifle as he peered into the darkness. The sound was still faint, but it was definitely coming their way, and there was an urgency to the rhythm that suggested pursuit rather than casual travel. "They've found our trail," he said grimly, already moving toward his horse. "We need to go now. This spring may be hidden, but the tracks leading to it are not." Lucy rose gracefully to her feet, her movements no longer stiff with pain, but flowing with renewed purpose. Their conversation had cleansed something toxic from the air between them, had allowed them to face the truth of their connection without the weight of unspoken guilt and resentment. They were no longer captor and victim, Apache and white woman, the bereaved and the guilty. They were simply two people who had found something worth protecting in each other. "Where do we go from here?" she asked as he helped her mount behind. "To him. Your people will never accept me, and mine will hunt us both as outlaws. We have no home, no family, no future that doesn't involve running and hiding." Raphael swung up into the saddle and kicked the stallion into motion, guiding them up a treacherous path that would be almost impossible to follow in the darkness. "There are places," he said, "hidden valleys in the high country where a man and woman can disappear completely. Places where the past cannot follow, and the future is whatever we choose to make it." "And what would we make it?" Lucy asked, her arms tightening around his waist as the horse picked its way carefully up the rocky slope. "Well, what kind of life could we build together, knowing what we know about each other's families?" Raphael was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. Behind them, the sound of pursuit was growing closer, but ahead lay the maze of canyons and mesas that he knew better than any white man alive. They would lose their pursuers in the labyrinth of stone, and then they would have all the time in the world to answer her question. "We would make it honest," he said finally. "We would build it on truth instead of lies, on chosen love instead of inherited hatred. We would make it a place where Apache children and white children could play together without fear, where the sins of the fathers need not be visited upon their children." The sound of her quiet laughter surprised him, warm and genuine despite their desperate circumstances. "A dreamer," she said. "I'm running away into the wilderness with an Apache dreamer who thinks love can overcome centuries of bloodshed." "Do you think it cannot?" Raphael asked, guiding the horse around a massive boulder that blocked the trail. Lucy was quiet for a long time, her cheek pressed against his back as she listened to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. When she finally answered, her voice carried a note of wonder that he had never heard before. "I think," she said slowly, "that if anyone could make such a dream come true, it would be a man who learned to love his enemy's daughter." The sun rose like a blood-soaked coin over the eastern peaks, casting long shadows across the maze of canyons where Raphael and Lucy had taken refuge. They had ridden hard through the night, their pursuers' torches visible as distant fireflies in the darkness behind them, until the treacherous terrain forced both hunter and hunted to seek shelter and wait for dawn. Now, perched on a narrow ledge high above the canyon floor, they could see the full extent of what was arrayed against them. Colonel Marcus Bonham had not died in the burning camp, as Raphael had hoped. Instead, the bastard had rallied his surviving men and somehow acquired Reinforcements, because the force tracking them now numbered at least 30 riders. They moved with military precision through the canyon below, splitting into smaller groups to cover every possible escape route while maintaining communication through a series of mirror signals that flashed in the morning light. This was no longer a simple manhunt by desperate outlaws. This had become a full-scale military operation commanded by a man who understood both strategy and the value of the prize he sought. "Professional soldiers," Raphael observed, studying the formations. Through a spyglass he had taken from one of the dead sentries. Cavalry, by the look of their equipment. Bonham must have offered them something very valuable to secure their cooperation. Lucy shifted beside him on the rocky ledge, her body pressed close to his for warmth in the thin mountain air. "My father," she said quietly. "He's offering them my father." Raphael lowered the spyglass and looked at her with confusion. "What do you mean?" "Jonathan Stone didn't just sell information about Apache camps," Lucy explained, her voice heavy with shame and bitter knowledge. "He's been running guns to both sides of every conflict in the territory for the past 5 years, selling weapons to the Apache, then selling their locations to the cavalry, profiting from the bloodshed while playing all factions against each other." The revelation hit Raphael like a physical blow. He had known that Stone was a traitor, but this was something far worse. This was systematic evil, the kind of calculated cruelty that turned human suffering into profit margins. "How do you know this?" he asked. "Because I helped him keep the books," Lucy said, and now tears were streaming down her face. "I thought he was just a merchant, maybe a little too eager to make deals with military buyers, but I never understood the full scope of what he was doing until I overheard him talking to a cavalry major about a shipment of stolen army rifles." She pulled her knees up to her chest, making herself small against the morning chill and the weight of her confession. "That's why I was traveling to Colorado, why I was on that wagon train when Bonham's men attacked us. I was running away, trying to get far enough from my father's business that his crimes couldn't touch me, but you can't outrun guilt, can you? You can't escape the blood on your family's hands." Raphael felt the world shift beneath him as the full implications of her words sank in. Jonathan Stone wasn't just a traitor. He was an arms dealer whose weapons had killed on both sides of every conflict in the territory. Apache warriors had died from bullets fired by guns Stone had sold to the cavalry. Cavalry soldiers had died from bullets fired by guns Stone had sold to the Apache. The man had turned the entire Indian Wars into his personal business venture. "Bonham knows about your father's operation," Raphael said, understanding flooding through him. "He's not just after you for revenge or ransom. He's after the location of Stone's weapon caches. With those guns, he could arm a private army large enough to take control of entire counties. Or sell them to the highest bidder," Lucy added. "Mexican revolutionaries, cattle barons fighting range wars, mining companies that need to clear out inconvenient Indian tribes. My father's weapons could fuel conflicts for decades." A new sound drifted up from the canyon below, the distinctive whistle of a cavalry bugle playing assembly. Raphael raised the spyglass again and cursed under his breath at what he saw. The soldiers weren't just searching anymore. They were setting up a siege, positioning men at every exit from the canyon system, while others began the slow, methodical process of scaling the walls. They had decided that Raphael and Lucy were trapped, and now they were prepared to wait as long as necessary to starve them out. "We need to move," Raphael said, already gathering their meager supplies. "They're closing the net, and this position will be surrounded within the hour." But as he helped Lucy to her feet, a new voice echoed off the canyon walls from somewhere below. It was amplified by a speaking trumpet, carrying clearly in the thin air, "Raphael Ghost Rider, I know you can hear me, you red-skinned son of a bitch. I've got a proposition for you." Raphael froze. recognizing the cultured Virginia accent, even distorted by the horn. Colonel Bonham had survived the fire, survived his wounds, and somehow managed to track them to this place. The man was like a cancer, impossible to kill, and always growing stronger. "I've got something you want," Bonham's voice continued. "Information about every Apache family still hiding in these mountains. Names, locations, everything you need. To warn them before the next cavalry sweep. All you have to do is bring me the girl, and we can make a trade." Lucy grabbed Raphael's arm, her fingers digging into his flesh. "He's lying," she whispered urgently. "It's a trap. You know it's a trap." "Of course it's a trap," Raphael replied, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty that worried her. "The question is whether the bait is worth the risk." Bonham's voice echoed again, closer now, as he climbed toward their position. "I know you're thinking about it, Ghost Rider. I know you're wondering how many of your people will die if you don't have that information. The cavalry's planning a major offensive, set to begin in 3 days. Without warning, every Apache camp from here to the Mexican border will be wiped out." Raphael felt the familiar weight of impossible choices settling on his shoulders like a yoke. If Bonham was telling the truth about the cavalry offensive, then hundreds of Apache families were about to be slaughtered. But if this was just another manipulation, another attempt to use his protective instincts against him, then walking into the trap would accomplish nothing except getting both him and Lucy killed. "There's something else you should know," Bonham called, and now his voice carried a note of genuine amusement. "Something about your dear departed wife, Morning Star. Something about what really happened at Bear Canyon." The words hit Raphael like arrows to the chest, driving the breath from his lungs and leaving him gasping. Morning Star had been dead for 3 years. Her body burned in the funeral pyre along with their unborn son. What could Bonham possibly know about her that Raphael did not already carry like poison in his heart? She didn't die in the massacre. "Ghost Rider!" Bonham's voice was closer now, echoing off the rocks directly below their position. "She survived the initial attack. We took her alive, along with a dozen other women, and before she died, she told us some very interesting things about Apache strongholds and supply caches." Raphael's world exploded into fragments of rage and disbelief. Morning Star, tortured for information before her death, his wife, who had never harmed a living soul, subjected to the kind of brutality that military men called interrogation. The very idea was obscene, impossible, unthinkable, but it would explain so much. The perfect timing of subsequent cavalry attacks, the way they had always known exactly where to strike for maximum damage, the systematic destruction of every Apache sanctuary Raphael had thought was secret. If Morning Star had been forced to reveal the locations under torture, if his own wife's suffering had been the source of his people's destruction. "You're going to go down there, aren't you?" Lucy said, and her voice carried the flat certainty of someone who already knew the answer. "You're going to walk into his trap, because you need to know the truth about what happened to her." Raphael nodded slowly, his hand already checking his weapons. "I have to," he said simply. "If there is even a chance that she suffered more than I knew, that her death was used to cause even more pain, then I cannot live with that uncertainty. And if it's a lie, if he's just trying to manipulate you into surrendering," Lucy asked, "then I will kill him slowly and feed his remains to the buzzards," Raphael replied, and his voice carried such cold certainty that Lucy shivered despite the growing warmth of the morning sun. She caught his arm as he started toward the path that led down from their ledge. "Take me with you," she said. "If you're walking into a trap, at least let us face it together." Raphael shook his head firmly. "This is not your fight, Lucy Stone. Your father's sins are not your responsibility, and my need for vengeance is not your burden to carry." "The hell it isn't," she said fiercely. Everything that's happened, everything we've both lost, it all comes back to the same source. My father's greed created this whole mess, and I'll be damned if I'm going to hide behind a rock while you clean it up alone." Before Raphael could object, Lucy was already moving down the treacherous path, her feet finding purchase on the loose shale with surprising grace. She might have been a merchant's daughter, but weeks of captivity and hard travel had toughened her in ways that went beyond mere physical endurance. She had found a core of steel within herself that no amount of hardship could bend. They descended together through the maze of switchbacks and narrow ledges that led to the canyon floor, where Colonel Bonham waited with his assembled force. The man looked like death warmed over, his face pale and drawn from blood loss and infection. His right wrist was wrapped in dirty bandages that showed dark stains where the wound continued to seep, and his eyes held the fevered brightness of a man running on hatred and opium. But he was still alive, still dangerous, and still surrounded by 30 armed men who looked like they would follow him into hell itself. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. "Well, well," Bonham said as they emerged from the rocks into the open space where he waited. "The famous Ghost Rider come to parley like a civilized man, and he's brought his pretty little prize with him. How touching." Raphael walked forward with his hands visible but ready to draw at the first sign of treachery. Lucy stayed close, behind him, her chin raised in defiance despite the obvious danger they faced. Around them, soldiers in dusty blue uniforms held their weapons ready but not yet aimed, professional fighters waiting for their commander's signal. "You said you had information about Morning Star," Raphael said without preamble. "I am here to listen, but if you try to play games with my wife's memory, I will show you what Apache justice looks like." Bonham's smile was a horrible thing, all teeth and malice, and the satisfaction of a predator who knows his prey has taken the bait. "Oh, I'm not playing games, Ghost Rider. I'm offering you truth, pure and simple. The truth about how your beloved wife spent her last hours on Earth." The colonel reached into his jacket with his good hand and withdrew a small leather pouch, which he tossed at Raphael's feet. "Look inside," he said. "Tell me if you recognize what you find." With trembling fingers, Raphael picked up the pouch and opened it. Inside was a silver bracelet, delicately worked with turquoise stones in the traditional Apache style. He had made it himself as a wedding gift for Morning Star, had spent weeks perfecting every detail of the intricate silver work she had worn it every day of their marriage, had been wearing it when the cavalry attacked their camp. "Where did you get this?" Raphael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "She gave it to me," Bonham replied. "Traded it for a cup of water during her third day of questioning. Funny how thirst can make people willing to bargain with their most precious possessions." Raphael's vision went red around the edges as rage consumed him like wildfire. The thought of Morning Star, heavy with child and wounded from the attack, being denied even water unless she traded away the symbol of their love, was almost more than his sanity could bear. But Lucy's voice cut through his fury like a blade through fog. "He's lying," she said clearly, and there was something in her tone that made even Bonham turn to look at her. "That bracelet was never Morning Star's. It's mine." The silence that followed her words was so complete that Raphael could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Bonham's confident smile faltered as he stared at Lucy with sudden uncertainty. "I commissioned that bracelet from an Apache silversmith in Santa Fe 6 months ago," Lucy continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I was learning about native craftsmanship for a book I was writing. The design is traditional, but there's a small modification I requested, a tiny cross worked into the pattern on the back. My father insisted on it as a condition of letting me wear heathen jewelry." Raphael turned the bracelet over with shaking hands, and there it was, a tiny Christian cross, barely visible among the traditional Apache symbols. It was exactly as Lucy had described, proof positive that Bonham had been lying about everything. "You bastard," Raphael said quietly, and his voice carried such menace that several of the surrounding soldiers took involuntary steps backward. "You would desecrate my wife's memory for the sake of a lie." Bonham's face twisted with frustrated rage as he realized his psychological gambit had backfired. "It doesn't matter," he snarled. "Lie or truth, you're still surrounded. You're still going to give me what I want, or I'll kill you both and take it anyway." But Raphael was no longer listening to the colonel's threats. His attention had shifted to Lucy, who had just revealed something that changed everything he thought he understood about their relationship. She had commissioned Apache jewelry, had been writing a book about native craftsmanship, had been immersing herself in his people's culture months before they had ever met. This was not the casual interest of a curious white woman. This was serious academic study. "Why?" he asked her quietly, ignoring the dozens of guns trained on them. "Why were you learning about my people's traditions?" Lucy met his eyes, with an expression that was both proud and vulnerable. "Because I wanted to understand," she said simply. "Because I was tired of seeing Apache people described as nothing but savages in every newspaper and government report. I wanted to document the truth about your culture, your art, your way of life, before it was completely destroyed by men like my father." The revelation hit Raphael like lightning, illuminating everything about their connection in a new and startling light. She had not simply been kind to Apache children out of general compassion. She had been actively working to preserve and honor his people's heritage. The book she had been writing, the cultural studies she had undertaken, the very bracelet that had exposed Bonham's lie, all of it represented a level of respect and dedication that went far beyond mere sympathy. "Enough!" Bonham roared, drawing his pistol with his left hand, despite the obvious pain the movement caused him. "I don't care about your touching little romance. I want Jonathan Stone's weapon caches, and I want them now. Tell me where they are, or I'll put bullets in both of you and find them myself." Raphael smiled then, an expression so cold and deadly that it made the surrounding soldiers shift nervously. "You want Jonathan Stone?" he asked. "Then perhaps we should ask him ourselves." Before anyone could react, Raphael let out a piercing whistle that echoed off the canyon walls like the cry of a hunting eagle. The sound was answered immediately by similar calls from the rocks above, and suddenly the canyon erupted with the thunder of hoofbeats as Apache warriors poured down from concealed positions on all sides. The trap had become a counter-trap, and Colonel Marcus Bonham was about to learn the difference between hunting a lone Apache and facing an entire war party led by the legendary Ghost Rider. The canyon exploded into chaos as 20 Apache warriors materialized from the rocks like spirits summoned from the earth itself. They came down the stone walls like water flowing downhill, their war cries echoing off the canyon walls in a symphony of rage and retribution that had been building for 3 years of loss and suffering. These were not reservation Indians broken by government handouts and missionary schools. These were the last free warriors of the Chiricahua Band, men who had chosen death before surrender and had been waiting for Raphael's signal to unleash their accumulated fury upon their enemies. Colonel Bonham's carefully planned siege dissolved into pandemonium as his soldiers found themselves caught in a killing ground with no cover and no escape routes. The professional cavalry troopers who had seemed so confident moments before were now screaming and diving for whatever protection they could find among the scattered boulders, their military discipline crumbling under the shock of finding themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered by the very savages they had come to hunt. Rifles cracked like thunder in the narrow confines of the canyon, but the Apache warriors had chosen their ground well, using every advantage that superior knowledge of terrain could provide. But this was not the random slaughter that white newspapers loved to sensationalize in their accounts of Indian atrocities. This was surgical warfare, conducted by men who had studied their enemy's tactics and learned to turn superior technology against itself. The Apache warriors moved in coordinated patterns that spoke of careful planning and intimate knowledge of the terrain, cutting off escape routes while herding their enemies into prepared killing zones where crossfire would be most effective. Every shot was calculated, every movement purposeful, every death serving the larger strategy of complete annihilation. Raphael himself had become something beyond human in the heat of battle, his movements flowing like liquid death as he wove. Between gunshots that seemed to pass through empty air where he had been a heartbeat before, his tomahawk split skulls with surgical precision, while his knife found the gaps between ribs with the accuracy of a surgeon's scalpel. Blood sprayed across the canyon walls as he moved from target to target, each kill swift and efficient and absolutely final. This was the Ghost Rider at his most terrible, the legend made flesh and set loose upon his enemies like a force of nature that could not be reasoned with or bargained with or stopped. A sergeant with 20 years of frontier experience tried to organize a defensive line among the scattered rocks, shouting orders that were lost in the chaos of battle. He managed to rally 5 men around a natural barricade, their Spencer rifles trained on the approaches, but his position lasted less than 2 minutes before Apache arrows began raining down from impossible angles. The warriors had climbed to positions that white soldiers would have considered inaccessible, turning the very stones into platforms for death. The sergeant died with 3 arrows in his chest, his final expression one of bewildered respect for enemies he had underestimated. Lucy pressed herself against the canyon wall and watched in fascination and horror as the man she had come to love transformed into something that existed beyond the boundaries of civilization. She had known intellectually that Raphael was a warrior, had seen the evidence of his killing skills in the burned remains of the outlaw camp. But this was different. This was witnessing the birth of legend, watching a human being transcend the limitations of mortality through sheer force of will and righteous fury. Every movement he made was perfect, every strike precisely calculated for maximum lethality. A young cavalry trooper, barely old enough to shave, broke from cover and ran toward her, his rifle raised and desperation in his eyes. She was the prize, the objective that would make this disaster worthwhile if he could just reach her and hold a gun to her head. His uniform was torn and blood-stained, his face white with terror, but he pressed forward with the desperate courage of a cornered animal. But he had taken only 3 steps when an Apache arrow sprouted from his chest like a deadly flower, the bronze point punching through his blue uniform coat to pierce his heart. He dropped without a sound, his weapon clattering uselessly on the stone. His young life ended before he had truly learned what it meant to live. The warrior who had loosed the arrow appeared on a ledge above them, his face painted in the black and white stripes of a Chiricahua war leader. Lucy recognized him immediately from Raphael's descriptions. Naiche, son of the great chief Cochise, one of the last free war leaders still fighting the endless war against American expansion. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 30 years old, with intelligent eyes that assessed her with careful interest before he leaped down to join the battle below. His movements were fluid and graceful, like a mountain cat descending from its rocky perch to stalk prey among the valley shadows. Naiche landed among a group of soldiers who were trying to reload their rifles, his war club already in motion before his feet touched the ground. The first man's skull caved in with a wet crunch that echoed off the canyon walls, while the second managed only a strangled cry before the club caught him in the temple. These were not the clumsy, rage-driven attacks that white soldiers expected from Indian warriors. This was artistry, each blow precisely placed to achieve maximum damage with minimum effort, each movement flowing seamlessly into the next like notes in a deadly symphony. Little brother. Nietzsche called to Raphael in the Apache language, his voice carrying easily over the gunfire and screaming. Is this the white woman you spoke of? The one worth abandoning the warrior's path for? Raphael paused in his slaughter long enough to glance back at Lucy, and she saw something in his eyes that she had never seen before, uncertainty. Not about the battle, which was already decided in their favor, but about something far more fundamental, about who he was and who he wanted to become, now that his 3-year quest for vengeance was finally bearing fruit. The question hung in the air between them, pregnant with implications that went far beyond the immediate violence. She is worth more than vengeance, Raphael replied in English, ensuring that Lucy could understand his words. She is worth the future we might build together. The words hit Lucy like a physical blow, their implications staggering in the context of the carnage surrounding them. Here, in the midst of a battle that would become legend among both Apache and white communities, Raphael was declaring his intention to choose love over hate, creation over destruction, hope over despair. It was a moment of profound transformation disguised as a simple statement of fact. Colonel Bonham, bleeding from a scalp wound and backed against the canyon wall with his remaining men, heard the exchange and laughed bitterly. The sound was harsh and broken, like a crow cawing over a battlefield strewn with corpses. The future, he gasped, his voice hoarse with pain and exhaustion. You think there's a future for you too? You think this ends here with my death? The colonel was dying. That much was obvious to everyone present. The infected wound on his wrist had spread poison through his system, turning his skin grey and filling his eyes with the fevered brightness of approaching death. The stress of battle had accelerated the process, and now he had perhaps minutes left before the toxins in. His blood stopped his heart forever. But even dying, he remained dangerous, a wounded predator whose last act would be to inflict as much damage as possible on his enemies. You stupid savage, Bonham continued, his words growing weaker but no less venomous. You think killing me solves anything? There are a dozen men just like me. All of them hunting Jonathan Stone's weapon caches, all of them willing to burn down half the territory to find them. Your little girlfriend's father has started something that won't end until every Apache is dead or on a reservation. Around them the battle was winding down as the last pockets of resistance were systematically eliminated. Apache warriors moved among the fallen soldiers with practiced efficiency, checking for signs of life and administering coup de grace where necessary. It was grim work, but necessary. Wounded enemies could still fight, and in Apache culture, it was considered merciful to end suffering quickly rather than allow it to linger. The stone floor of the canyon was slick with blood, and the air was thick with the metallic smell of death. Lucy stepped forward, her boots splashing through puddles of crimson as she approached the dying colonel. Her face was pale but determined, and there was steel in her spine that reminded Raphael of the finest Apache women he had known. "Where is he?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the moans of the wounded. "Where is my father hiding?" Bonham's smile was a horrible thing, all teeth and approaching death, and the malicious satisfaction of a man who knew secrets that others desperately wanted. "Wouldn't you like to know? The great merchant prince living like a king on blood money, while his daughter runs around the desert with her pet Apache. He's got plans, that one. Big plans that involve selling enough weapons to both sides to turn this whole territory into a charnel house." "Tell me where he is," Lucy repeated. And now there was steel in her voice that reminded Raphael of the warriors he had fought beside. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides, her knuckles white with the effort of controlling her rage. "Tell me, and I'll make sure you die quickly instead of slowly." The colonel looked at her with something that might have been respect mixed with his hatred. Death was approaching fast, but he still had enough strength left for one final act. Of malice, You've got spine, girl. I'll give you that. More spine than your coward father, hiding behind his money and his hired guns, while better men do his dirty work for him." He coughed violently, and blood flecked his lips as his internal injuries took their toll. The poison from his infected wound was winning its race through his circulatory system, shutting down organs one by one in a process that would have been fascinating to a medical man, but was simply agonizing to experience. "Denver," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the dying sounds of battle. "Federal Bank Building, top floor. He's got himself a nice little office where he can play puppet master with half the Indian wars in the West." Lucy nodded grimly, filing the information away in her memory with the care of a scholar recording important research. This was the break they had been hoping for, the first solid lead on her father's whereabouts after months of uncertainty. "And the weapons caches, where are they?" But Bonham's eyes had already gone glassy with approaching death, the light fading from them like candles being snuffed out one by one. His final breath escaped in a rattling sigh that echoed off the canyon walls, a sound that seemed to carry with it all the malice and hatred that had sustained him through his final weeks of life. Whatever secrets he had taken to his grave would remain there, locked away from the living world he had done so much to corrupt and destroy. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the groans of wounded men and the harsh breathing of survivors trying to process what had just occurred. Of the 30 soldiers who had entered the canyon in pursuit of Raphael and Lucy, fewer than half were still alive, and most of those were too badly wounded to pose any future threat. Blood pooled among the rocks, already attracting the first tentative flies that would soon multiply into clouds. It had been a complete victory for the Apache war party, but Raphael took no satisfaction in the slaughter. Naiche approached him, wiping blood from his war club with practiced efficiency. The weapon was an ancient design, passed down through generations of Chiricahua leaders, its handle worn smooth by countless hands, and its stone head stained dark with the blood of enemies. "It is finished, little brother," he said in Apache, his voice carrying the ritual cadences of a victory chant. "The soldiers are dead. Their leader has joined his ancestors, and our people have tasted revenge for Bear Canyon. Surely now you can find peace." But Raphael shook his head slowly, his eyes fixed on Lucy as she knelt beside Colonel Bonham's body. The sight of her there, surrounded by death but unbowed by it, filled him with a complex mixture of pride and concern. She was stronger than any woman he had ever known, but strength had its limits, and he wondered how much more violence she could witness before something inside her broke beyond repair. "It is not finished," he said quietly. The colonel spoke. "Truly, there are others like him, other men who will hunt us until we are dead or captured. And now we know that Jonathan Stone is alive and still spreading poison throughout the territory. Then we hunt him down and kill him." Naiche said simply, his tone suggesting that this was the most obvious solution in the world. "We find this Jonathan Stone and add his scalp to our war belts. It is the Apache way, the path our fathers walked and their fathers before them." "No," Lucy said, rising from beside the colonel's corpse with movements that spoke of newfound resolve. Blood stained the hem of her dress, but her voice was clear and strong. "It's not the Apache way we need now. It's something new, something that can break the cycle of vengeance and counter-vengeance that's been destroying both our peoples for generations." Both men stared at her in surprise, struck by the certainty in her voice and the strength that radiated from her small frame. This was not the frightened captive they had rescued from the outlaw camp, nor even the determined survivor who had endured weeks of captivity without breaking. This was a woman who had found her purpose and would not be turned aside from it by anyone, white or Apache, friend or enemy. "My father has committed crimes that go beyond personal vengeance," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. He has armed both sides of conflicts, profited from the deaths of Apache families and cavalry soldiers alike. He has turned human suffering into a business model, and that makes him everyone's enemy, not just ours. She looked directly at Raphael, her eyes blazing with conviction that seemed to burn brighter than the desert sun itself. You want to break the cycle of violence? Then we don't kill Jonathan Stone. We expose him. We gather evidence of his crimes and present it to the territorial authorities, to the federal marshals, to the newspapers. We make him face justice instead of just vengeance. Naicha snorted in disgust, his expression showing exactly what he thought of such naive idealism. White man's justice, he said contemptuously, spitting in the dust to show his disdain. Courts and lawyers and judges who will find reasons to excuse any crime committed against Apache people. You trust too much in a system that sees us as less than human, as obstacles to be removed rather than people deserving of protection. Maybe, Lucy admitted, her honesty surprising both warriors. But what's the alternative? Keep killing each other until there's no one left to remember what we were fighting about in the first place? Keep feeding the cycle of revenge until it consumes everything good and decent in both our cultures? Her words hung in the air like smoke from a ceremonial fire, challenging everything the Apache warriors had believed about justice and retribution. Around them, the other members of the war party had gathered to listen, their faces reflecting the internal struggle between traditional notions of revenge and the innovative approach being proposed by this white woman who had somehow earned the right to speak among them as an equal. Raphael found himself caught between two worlds, two philosophies, two different visions of what justice might look like in a territory torn apart by decades of conflict. The warrior in him agreed with Nietzsche. Jonathan Stone deserved to die for his crimes, and Apache justice would be swift and final and deeply satisfying. But the part of him that had learned to love Lucy Stone, that had seen the possibility of a different future, was intrigued by her radical proposal. What if there was another way? What if the very system that had oppressed his people could be turned against itself? There is wisdom in what she says, he said finally, speaking to Nietzsche in Apache but loud enough for all the warriors to hear. The white man's law has been used against our people many times, but it might also be used to protect them. If we can prove that Stone's weapons have killed white soldiers as well as Apache warriors, you would trust the same government that murdered your wife and child? Nietzsche asked incredulously, his voice rising with disbelief. You would put your faith in the same courts that have stolen our land and broken every treaty they ever signed with our people? I would use that government's own laws against itself, Raphael replied, his voice growing stronger as the logic of the plan became clearer to him. If we can prove that Jonathan Stone sold weapons to Apache warriors that were then used to kill cavalry soldiers, the army will want his head as much as we do. We make him everyone's enemy, and then we let his own people destroy him according to their own rules. Lucy stepped closer to both men, her eyes bright with the possibility she saw in Raphael's words. The idea was audacious, revolutionary, potentially suicidal, but it offered something that pure vengeance could not provide. Exactly, she said. We turn his strength against him. He's spent years playing all sides against each other, profiting from chaos and conflict. Now we do the same to him. The surviving Apache warriors had been listening to this exchange with growing interest, their faces reflecting the internal struggle between traditional notions of revenge and the innovative approach being proposed. These were intelligent men, veterans of countless battles, who understood strategy and tactics better than most white generals. The idea of using their enemies' own systems against them had obvious appeal, even if it went against everything they had been taught about honor and warfare. It would be dangerous, observed Chato, one of Nietzsche's most trusted lieutenants. He was an older man, scarred by decades of fighting, his grey hair braided with the feathers of eagles he had killed with his own hands. Going into white man's territory, gathering evidence, trusting in laws that have never protected Apache people. We could all end up dead or imprisoned, and our sacrifice would accomplish nothing. We could end up dead anyway if we keep fighting the same war the same way, Raphael pointed out, his logic cutting through traditional thinking like a blade through cloth. At least this path offers the possibility of something different, something that might actually change the conditions that created this conflict in the first place. Nietzsche studied him for a long moment, reading the determination in his war leader's eyes and recognizing the fundamental change that had occurred in his friend's worldview. "You have changed, little brother," he said finally, his voice carrying both sadness and understanding. The man who came to us 3 years ago, burning with hatred and thirsting for blood, would never have considered such a course. "Love changes a man," Raphael said simply, his eyes never leaving Lucy's face. "It makes him want to build instead of just destroy, to create instead of simply taking vengeance." The war leader nodded slowly, understanding flooding his weathered features like sunrise over the mountains. He had seen this transformation before in young warriors who found women worthy of their devotion, had watched as the fire of pure rage was tempered into something more complex and ultimately more powerful. "Then we will try this new path," he decided, his words carrying the weight of absolute authority. "But if white man's justice fails us, if their courts refuse to punish Stone for his crimes against both our peoples, then we return to the old ways. We give peace a chance, but we do not surrender our right to take vengeance if peace proves impossible." Lucy felt a wave of relief wash over her as she realized the magnitude of what had just been decided. These men, who had every reason to trust only in violence and revenge, were willing to risk their lives on the possibility of a better way. It was more than she had dared hope for, a victory that felt almost as significant as their military triumph in the canyon. 3 weeks later, Denver's Federal Bank building rose before them like a monument to American capitalism, its red brick facade gleaming in the afternoon sun, while horse-drawn carriages clattered past on cobblestone streets that had never known the sound of Apache war cries. Lucy stood at the corner of Larimer and 16th Street, her appearance transformed by the respectable traveling dress and carefully arranged hair that marked her as just another merchant's daughter conducting business in the territorial capital. Raphael watched from the shadows of an alley across the street, his own transformation even more dramatic. Gone were the war paint and traditional Apache clothing. Instead, he wore the dark suit and bowler hat of a traveling businessman, his long hair cut short and his weapons concealed beneath the respectable facade. To casual observers, he appeared to be nothing more than another Eastern entrepreneur seeking opportunities in the growing Western markets. The plan they had developed was intricate and dangerous, requiring precise timing and absolute trust. Sarah Mackenzie, Lucy's cousin, had proven to be exactly the ally they needed, a young woman whose moral convictions outweighed family loyalty and whose position as senior secretary to the bank's board provided access to Jonathan Stone's private offices. She'd spent 2 weeks photographing documents, building a comprehensive record of her uncle's criminal enterprise. Lucy took a deep breath and walked through the bank's ornate entrance, her heels clicking on imported marble floors. The lobby was a testament to financial power, with gilt-framed portraits watching over mahogany desks where clerks processed the paperwork of Western expansion. She approached the reception desk with confident bearing, though her stomach churned. With nervous anticipation, "Lucy Stone to see Mr. Jonathan Stone," she told the receptionist. "I believe he's expecting me." As she rode the mechanical lift toward her confrontation, Lucy reviewed the evidence Sarah had gathered with painstaking care. Shipping manifests for weapons deliveries to both cavalry forts and Apache trading. Posts, financial records showing payments from military contractors and tribal leaders alike. Correspondence detailing the systematic manipulation of conflicts to maximize weapon sales. It painted Jonathan Stone not as a simple war profiteer, but as an architect of genocide. She paused before the mahogany doors that bore her father's name in gold lettering, gathering courage for a confrontation that would determine everyone's fate. Behind these doors waited the man whose greed had set everything in motion. Raphael's lost family, her own captivity, the territory turned into a charnel house where both sides destroyed each other with weapons he had provided. Jonathan Stone looked up from his desk as she entered, his face lighting with apparent pleasure. He was distinguished in his late 50s, silver hair perfectly groomed, expensive suit, tailored to conceal the soft living that wealth had afforded. But Lucy noticed details that had escaped her attention in childhood. The calculating coldness in his pale blue eyes, the way his smile never reached them, the unconscious arrogance of a man who had never doubted his right to use others as tools. "Lucy, my dear girl," he said, rising from behind a massive desk. "I had hoped you would come to your senses and return home. I trust your little adventure in the wilderness taught you something about the realities of life outside civilized society." "It taught me quite a lot, Father," Lucy replied, her voice carefully neutral. "About the price of greed, about the consequences of treating human beings as commodities, about the difference between civilization and mere wealth." Jonathan's expression shifted, paternal warmth giving way to shrewd wariness. "I see your ordeal has filled you with romantic notions about noble savages and the evils of commerce. That's understandable, but let me remind you of certain practical realities." He gestured toward an expensive leather chair. "The Apache are a dying people, Lucy. Nothing can change that fundamental fact. The question is whether their inevitable defeat serves some useful purpose or merely represents waste. I have ensured that their resistance contributes to the territory's economic development, rather than simply draining resources through prolonged military campaigns." Lucy remained standing, hands clasped behind her back to conceal their trembling. "By selling weapons to both sides," she said quietly, "by prolonging the conflict to maximize your profits, by turning human suffering into a business model." For the first time, Jonathan's mask slipped entirely, revealing cold calculation. Beneath, by providing necessary services to customers who would have obtained those weapons elsewhere if I had not sold them, by bringing efficiency to a market that would have existed with or without my participation. He moved to a window overlooking Denver's growing skyline. "Look out there, daughter. See what American enterprise has accomplished. Cities rising from empty prairie, railroads connecting distant markets, telegraph lines carrying information across vast distances. This is civilization, and it requires sacrifice from those unable to adapt to progress." "Sacrifice," Lucy repeated, her voice carrying steel that would have made Raphael proud. "Is that what you call the massacre at Bear Canyon? The murder of pregnant women and children who posed no threat to anyone?" Jonathan frowned with mild irritation rather than guilt. "I provided information about hostile Apache positions to military commanders tasked with maintaining territorial order. What they did with that information was their responsibility, not mine." "Information you sold for profit," Lucy pressed. "Information that led directly to the deaths of innocent families. Information that saved the lives of white settlers who would have been killed in Apache raids," Jonathan countered. "Every Apache warrior killed was one less threat to the women and children of our own people." Lucy felt revulsion wash over her as she recognized the twisted logic that allowed her father to sleep peacefully while profiting from genocide. And the weapons you sold to the Apache, were those also sold to protect white settlers? For the first time, Jonathan hesitated. The Apache would have obtained weapons regardless of my involvement, he said finally. At least by selling to them myself, I could control the quality and quantity, ensuring they were never quite well enough equipped to pose a serious threat to organized military forces. Listen. The admission confirmed everything Lucy had suspected about the systematic nature of his crimes. He had not simply profited from existing conflicts, but had actively managed them, calibrating weapon flows to both sides to ensure maximum carnage with minimum risk to his own interests. "You controlled the war," Lucy said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You decided who lived and who died. You played Apache families and cavalry troops against each other like pieces on a chessboard." Jonathan's face hardened as he recognized that his daughter could not be bought off with justifications. "I exercised intelligent business judgment in a complex market situation," he said coldly. "If you came here hoping to appeal to some imaginary conscience, you have wasted your time and mine." "I came here to give you a chance," Lucy replied, her voice growing stronger. "A chance to make amends, to use your wealth to help the people you've harmed, to find some path toward redemption." Jonathan laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "Redemption? From whom? The savages who would have killed every white person in the territory, the bleeding heart missionaries, the government officials who owe their positions to the very conflicts I helped finance." He returned to his desk and withdrew. "A small silver derringer. You've been traveling with that Apache murderer, haven't you? The one they call Ghost Rider. I suppose he filled your head with romantic nonsense about noble warriors and evil white men." Lucy's blood turned to ice as she realized her father had been prepared for this confrontation. "How do you know about Raphael?" "I know everything. That happens in my territory," Jonathan replied with cold satisfaction. "I know about the attack on Colonel Bonham's camp, about the Apache warriors who helped you escape, about the foolish plan to expose my business arrangements through legal channels." He raised the pistol, aiming at Lucy's heart. "Did you really think you could walk into my stronghold and threaten me with evidence and moral outrage? Did you imagine that a few photographs and stolen documents could bring down an enterprise I've spent 20 years building?" But Lucy's response was not the terrified surrender he expected. Instead, she smiled with confidence that sent chills down his spine. "I imagined that you would react exactly as you have," she said calmly, "with threats and violence and the absolute certainty that money and power could overcome any opposition." "What are you talking about?" Jonathan demanded, uncertainty creeping into his voice. "I'm talking about the federal marshals who are currently surrounding this building," Lucy explained, her smile growing wider. "I'm talking about the photographers who have been documenting your confession through the windows across the street. I'm talking about the newspaper reporters waiting downstairs to interview you about your role in prolonging the Indian Wars for personal profit." Jonathan's face went white. "You're bluffing," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Lucy asked, moving toward the window. "Look outside, Father. See if you can spot the rifle barrels pointed at this office from every rooftop. Count the uniformed men in the street below. Tell me if you think this is a bluff." Jonathan stumbled to the window, his eyes scanning the street below with growing horror as he recognized the signs of a coordinated law enforcement operation. Federal marshals in dark coats stood at every intersection, their badges glinting in sunlight. Sharpshooters were visible on rooftops, weapons trained on the bank building. A crowd of reporters and photographers had gathered around the entrance, cameras ready to capture the moment when one of the territory's most prominent citizens was led away in chains. "This is impossible," he whispered, his hand trembling as he struggled to maintain his grip on the derringer. "The territorial government Depends on my financial support. The military contractors need my services. The bank board would never allow... The bank board received copies of all your correspondence yesterday morning, Lucy interrupted, along with detailed financial records showing how you've used their institution to launder money from illegal sales. They're downstairs right now, meeting with federal investigators to discuss minimizing their own legal exposure. She stepped closer, no longer afraid of the wavering pistol. It's over, Father. The evidence is overwhelming, the witnesses are credible, and the political climate has shifted. The new territorial governor campaigned on ending corruption, and your prosecution will establish his reformist credentials with Washington. Jonathan Stone, the man who had orchestrated years of bloodshed for profit, who had turned human suffering into financial success, finally understood that his empire was crumbling. The derringer slipped from nerveless fingers to clatter on expensive carpet, followed by the man himself as his legs gave out. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice hollow with defeat. "Now you face justice," Lucy said simply. "Not Apache justice, which would be swift and final, but American justice, which will be slow and public and complete. You'll stand trial for treason, conspiracy, murder. The newspapers will document every detail. History will remember you not as a successful businessman, but as a war criminal who profited from genocide." The office door burst open to admit federal marshals led by Chief Deputy Marshal William Henderson. Behind them came Sarah Mackenzie, her arms full of documents and photographs that would serve as evidence. "Jonathan Stone," Marshal Henderson said formally, "you are under arrest for treason, conspiracy to commit murder, illegal arms trafficking, and violations of federal treaties with Indian tribes." As they led her father away in shackles, Lucy felt complex emotions washing over her. Satisfaction in seeing justice served, but sadness for the man her father might have been. Relief that the hunt was over, but uncertainty about what came next. The answer appeared in the doorway as the marshals departed. Raphael Ghost Rider, still wearing the businessman's disguise, stepped into the office that had been the center of so much evil. His eyes found Lucy immediately, and in them she saw not the cold fury of the warrior, but the warm affection of a man who had learned to choose love over vengeance. "It is finished," he said simply, crossing to take her in his arms. "Yes," she agreed, leaning into his embrace with relief and hope for the future they might now build together. "It's finally finished." Through the windows, they could see the sun setting over the Rocky Mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded them both of the desert canyons where they had found each other. Below, Denver continued its bustling existence, largely unaware that a chapter in the territory's bloody history had just ended. But in the mountains beyond the city, Apache warriors sat around their fires and spoke of a new kind of victory, one won not with tomahawks and rifles, but with patience and evidence, and the radical notion that justice might be possible, even for people written off as obstacles to progress. The Blood Rider's vengeance was complete, but Raphael Ghost Rider's true journey was just beginning. In a territory where Apache and white communities were slowly learning to see each other as human beings rather than enemies, there would be much work to do. Schools to build, treaties to negotiate, wounds to heal. It would be the work of a lifetime, but work that could be done by two people who had learned that love was stronger than hate, that justice was more satisfying than revenge, and that the future belonged to those brave enough to choose hope over despair. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.